with you, Simon. Briefly introduce yourself, what you do, and what you do maybe on a day-to-day basis that supports the energy transition.
Yeah, hi there. I'm Simon Hindley. I'm a naval architect and managing director at SOCSEA Marine Engineering. Work in renewable energy and clean shipping, and that's kind of how we're supporting the energy transition essentially as a focus for us as a business. We're working to create a brighter future, and that kind of underpins everything that we do.
Julia.
Thank you. My name is Julia Makin. I'm Head of Sustainability Projects and Partnerships at the Port of London Authority. So my role involves working across the Thames on a range of different environmental issues, predominantly looking at decarbonising the Thames and operations on the Thames, working with operators to accelerate that transition.
Hi, my name is Tom Beard. I work for BMT and I'm the clean shipping lead. So within that role, I head up all of clean maritime for BMT within the UK, but I'm also their global lead for alternative fuels and how we can use other energy other than dead dinosaurs within the energy transition.
Hello, my name is Peter Livy. I'm Managing Director of HMM Great Britain, so a large container shipping company. And with regards to energy transition, my other job title was Global Sustainability Ambassador. So involved in aspects of decarbonising the maritime supply chain.
Thanks. Okay, on to questions, and I'll go down to each of you at this to start with, one at a time. First question then: who do you believe is responsible for the transition to a cleaner future? Simon.
Well, that's a tricky one. I think it's a global challenge. It's got to be a global solution. So I think we're all responsible for it in some shape or form, whether that's determining our actions as individuals, but then also as nations, as states, in terms of providing the framework to enable it to happen. I think so. I think it's an all-round responsibility.
Yes, I have to echo that. I think the energy transition is going to take a collaborative effort by private and public sector organisations, individuals and communities. To really get to the nub of the issue, I think we need to get around the table. The Port of London Authority, who I work for, is a self-funding trust port, and that puts us in the unique position that we operate for the benefit of stakeholders rather than shareholders. So we're really able to prioritise issues of concern to everybody and convene people in a fairly neutral fashion to look at things like barriers and opportunities for decarbonisation. And through doing so, the Port of London Authority can really look at its own leadership in that space and what we can do to enable and unblock some of those issues.
Unsurprisingly, I think almost everyone on this panel is going to say we all do, but actually I think it's a bit more for all of us in this room. We're here for a reason, because we want to really push this, and so actually there's a bit around the educational piece that we can do as leaders in this domain to educate everyone else in the issues such that it helps speed up this transition.
Echoing what's already been said, and obviously that being able to lead by example is important, but very much who's responsible? The person in the mirror.
Okay, similar for this next question. What is Solace doing specifically to support the energy transition? Give me an example of what you're actually doing now.
Yeah, so there's probably quite a lot in terms of projects and work we undertake. Looking at shipping as an example, we're working across lots of different fuel types and energy sources, agnostically with no bias, so we can understand where different fuel options might fit best, but then looking at that from what does it do to the vessel design, how do we work with regulators, how do we throw it out wider than that, but then also looking at it in terms of the whole sort of holistic picture. So it's looking at, okay, well actually, if you're rebuilding a vessel, for instance, where's the steel coming from? Are you recycling another vessel or not? And actually looking at that broader picture, where does the fuel come from? Is it actually going to be a green source? Is it going to be something which is going to have a net benefit? Or actually is it just making life difficult for yourself. So for us, example projects, clean shipping across a range of fuel types, so pure battery, electric, hydrogen in a gaseous form, methanol, ammonia, and hybrids of some of those as well. So we're working through them all, understanding the pros and cons and kind of the broader impact of them.
And the Port of London Authority, Julia, what are you doing?
Thank you. Yes, so hopefully speaking to Peter's point before about leading by example, we've targeted net zero by 2040 in our own operations. We've already seen an 83% reduction in our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and that's predominantly because we transitioned to hydro-treated vegetable oil in our fleet rather than diesel as it were previously. So that's our own operations. We're also investing £58 million in over 5 years in new technology, a new port control centre, which should future-proof the resilience of the whole port for the next 25 years, which will obviously enable growth at the same time as being able to achieve net zero transition. And then finally, we work with others, so we can't do it alone. So we use our position, as I've mentioned already, to convene others. Next week, I will be talking to Thames-based operators, regulators and other public bodies in a coalition, net zero coalition. And so far, the workshops that we've held with this group of individuals has really helped us to put together a plan for achieving net zero together on the Thames and accelerating that transition.
So what's DMT doing?
So we design vessels as part of what we do. We had one of the first hybrid crew transfer vessels in the world, was one of our designs. So we were pushing that years ago. We've got LNG. I appreciate LNG is not the solution, but as we've seen, like Maersk is moving in that direction. So we've had an LNG ferry. We've just signed contracts for more electric ferries in the US. But we've also invested in what we're doing, so it's all of our skills, so we're upskilling our staff such that we want to be, paraphrasing it, fit to fight when the energy transition comes into play, but at the same time it's educating customers on what they need, because it is going to be a variety.
And last but not least, Peter, what was HMM doing?
Well, HMM have been involved since the early noughties in the sustainability journey, and we're one of the early members of what's called the Clean Cargo Working Group, which created some of the initial methodologies to enable us to measure stuff and know if we were improving. So since 2008, we've reduced our emissions according to Clean Cargo methodology by about 2010, we've reduced by about 64% our CO2 equivalent emissions. And according to Greenhouse Gas Protocol, going back to 2008, it's about 68.2%. We're at the end of the road with regards to efficiencies and all that sort of stuff. It is very much now on what comes next. So the projects that we're involved in at the moment are very broad. So yes, we're researching LNG, but it is a stepping stone. We've got some methanol ships, dual fuel ships at the moment coming in next year and the year after. We've got a couple of ammonia ships in test. Our biggest project at the moment is onboard carbon capture. So we've got a 2,100 TU vessel that we got fitted out, and it's undergoing tests at the moment because that's very important in the interim. In conjunction with biofuels, etc., to see what we can do to prolong the life of what is already there, but recognising what needs to change going forwards. We've revised our carbon neutral target. We'd rather say absolute zero, because we found that term is used in different ways. But our target has moved from 2050 to 2045 now, the latest estimates. But yeah, we are researching all manner of fuels, including one of the previous sessions this morning was small modular reactors, molten salt. So we have to look at everything to find out what we need for the future.
Yes, that's Peter. Change tack slightly. I'll ask the question. Feel free to just, anyone that wants to answer, just jump in. What role do national governments have in the energy transition? Or maybe, what role should they have? Who's going to jump in there?
Well, I think, so from a more international perspective, because there's all sorts of different types of political systems and regulators that are local, that are national, that are international. So certainly regulation has to facilitate the change, to enable first movers to be able to move and to be able to have sustainable practices built in to how business operates. Bottom-up action is really important, not just top-down. And given the scale of societal onboarding that's required, that's fairly crucial. Not sure how you do all of these things, but it's just how to promote renewable energy and accelerate the phase out of the fossil fuels.
Yeah, and I'd add to that to say, if we're looking at the example of UK government, for example, what you need is a target, which we have, then legally binding amounts over a period of time, every 5 years, that says how much you're legally allowed to emit as a country, the policies then that underpin the change that we need to see, and of course the budget behind it. And all of this, of course, coupled with a sector-specific form of engagement, which we're just starting to see more of. We're very excited to hear more about the new National Wealth Fund. That will see a 1.8 billion investment in ports, particularly looking at the role ports can play in the transition as a whole, supporting industrial decarbonisation, as well as things like green hydrogen. And what's particularly interesting about this in the context of the conversation that we're having here is the plan from government to leverage £3 of private cash for every £1 of government funding invested. So we all understand that to solve the issues of climate change, it's going to require a huge nationwide investment programme, and neither public nor private can solve that alone. So looking at a way of leveraging that funding seems to be a sensible next step.
I just want to, you talked about money and funding, and that really is the next question, is who should pay for it? Who pays ultimately for the energy transition?
So I think we all need to pay. I think we need to accept, and it's a bit difficult when interest rates have been so high, but we need to accept that things will cost more if we're going to be green. But at the end of the day, it's better that it costs a little bit more now than things don't happen, because potentially what the consequences are catastrophic, right? And that's the reality of it.
Yeah, just to echo that, I think that's exactly it. Like you said, it's a shared responsibility. And coming back to the government sort of involvement piece as well, I think it's, if there's, in terms of some of their role to support the adoption and movement, I think that's really key. So if you've got, so if you're looking at fuel as an example, you've got supply and a demand sort of side. If one is waiting on the other to start action in terms of investment and facilities, then perhaps that's government's role, is then to step in to try to break any of those sort of chicken and egg sort of lockout cycles to try to get some momentum going.
Just to come back to one of Tom's points there, yes, I think there's the Office of Budget Responsibility. There's quite a stark statement from them, which is delaying climate action by a decade will see the cost double. So if we think that the costs are big now, then they're only going to increase the more that we delay action.
I think the only thing I would like to add is, it also needs a fair level playing field with regard to who's paying, where they're paying, and the EU ETS has been a great initiative, but when the Ministry of Transport in China says that Chinese shippers shouldn't pay, and so on and so forth, it illustrates that we need to be doing something that is fair and that makes sense internationally to tackle how to tackle this global problem.
It's interesting responses about who pays, because to give you an example of shore power in this country, you've got a situation where there may well be a shore power facility, but that vessel won't connect because the electricity cost is higher than what they're paying for their diesel. Yeah, it's just it's at some point either we have to force people through legislation or taxing emissions. Yeah.
Yeah, and the additional point is, well, has the port got the energy in the first place, which most of them don't,
Yeah.
looking around Europe. And we've got ships already, because we've been plugging in for several years in California and places. We've got lots of ships that have got the equipment to use shore power, but not the ports that have got the shore power.
Okay, new question. What is your opinion of the future energy mix? What do you think? And then this is the question that everyone wants answered. What will be the dominant fuel?
There won't be one, not for quite some time, right? We've already seen it, so Maersk with methanol, now they're going back to LNG to an extent. You've got ammonia in the mix. I think the one thing that's guaranteed is electric is required no matter what. And like yesterday we saw that there's 4 petawatts of electricity that are required to decarbonise maritime. We need that, and then what you do with that afterwards, which fuel? The next step is hydrogen, you need hydrogen, and then after that hydrogen is then the building block for all these fuels. But what we do, the mix, it's a holistic approach. Every vessel type's different. Do we change our operating profile? Do we look at how we're operating the vessels such that we can change that so that we might be able to use some of these other fuels instead? Because they're all less energy dense, so we've got a problem there as well.
Yeah, totally agree. I heard a saying yesterday at the conference, and it was there's not a silver bullet, but it's silver buckshot. And I thought that was quite nice, because it is that. So duty cycle dependent on the vessel. If you want pure electric, you might run up to a day, 24 hours tops, but then the battery weight drives the design. Then your next option might be a hydrogen fuel cell, for example, but then the volume required for gaseous storage of hydrogen after, say, 2 to 3 days of operating profile, that'll then start overwhelming the design of the vessel. And then you've got that mix of nearshore coastal options where those might be a fitting solution. Then you've got deep sea trades where you have a much higher energy density requirement, which is then like your ammonias, your methanols, and like I said, are half as energy dense. So that again, that's either a reduction in payload or a change in the operating profile. So whether there's digital tools on the kind of the how do we optimize routes and timings and everything else, whether there's things to be done to help like the system efficiency of transport, perhaps some other things there too. But yeah, for me anyway, it's a mix at the moment.
Yeah, considering that 80 or 90% of goods are involved in often deep sea transportation, it links very well to the cost question as well. So the cost of most of the, looking at deep sea containers for a moment, of the alternative fuels, so they could be 300 or 400% the cost of fuel that we're using just now. And we've been doing all this slow steaming to try and reduce carbon emissions. Well, we've been doing slow steaming to reduce cost with many of these fuels. And one of the interesting things about the increasing awareness of things like nuclear, which we had a session on previously, was that it's one of the few solutions that looks to be lower operating cost, although it's got high capex to begin with. But you need far less ships because they can go much faster. And so there are many challenges on lots of sides. We have to have an alignment of various global perspectives on the use of these fuels. The cost of, say, building up a bunkering network for toxic and corrosive ammonia, for instance, and the health and safety of crew amongst some of these things, and the enormous amount of fuel that needs to be supplied. And we see, for instance, for methanol, that China's looks as though they'll be supplying about 70% of global needs at the moment, because many players aren't stepping up. And one of the big issues is, well, if there is no fuel supply, that might define what you're going to be using.
Yeah, and from a Port of London Authority perspective, I think we obviously work with a wide range of users, and we're seeing a lot of focus on the inland side of things on hydrogen, green hydrogen and electrification. But for us, of course, it really makes sense to maintain a strategic perspective, because we'll be looking at our international clients as well. And actually, by looking more broadly rather than narrowing down focus, at least in the short term, it means that we can spot synergies between both the inland and the international, but also the river and the industry that surrounds it. So, for example, something like hydrogen fuel cell or green hydrogen will have application, obviously, for mobility and other sectors moving out from the river. A report written for us in 2021 by Royal Haskoning looked at things like biomethanol being a type of fuel that might be suitable both for inland and international. So for us, we remain agnostic, at least in the kind of short to medium term, because we feel that will lead us to better solutions and solutions that people then can have confidence in and invest into.
Yeah, just share some thoughts of my own really. It's like all of these fuels, each of them come with their own challenges, their own unique challenges. But also I think it's not shared, we're not educating people in the right way. But, we say, for example, saying like methanol is green and zero emission. It isn't. You're still producing carbon atoms somewhere. Ammonia's got its issue with NOx and SOx as well. And nuclear, there wasn't the word emission used in the presentation, but those emissions are around for many years, and we're passing that problem to our kids and their kids. So there's some challenges that we're going to encounter along the way. So next question. Recently adopted 2023 IMO greenhouse gas strategy sets out a 40% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. However, this is only an ambition. There's currently no binding commitment from member states. So, is the IMO on the right path, or should they take a different approach?
Okay, shall I address that? So, I found it rather disappointing when there were no binding commitments from the IMO. But when you bear in mind you've got an organisation with 176 member countries, it's a major win to get any agreement on anything. So it's something that we need is international institutions to facilitate a swift and fair transition. But when they're moving very, very slowly, that's a huge challenge. In my personal opinion, the proposal made by the World Shipping Council for the Green Balance mechanism, which facilitates a new approach to the IMO technical measures, which makes it possible to close the price gap between fossil fuels and what we'll call green fuels at the lowest overall cost. So just to unpack that slightly, I've got a picture in front of me so I can remember. The Green Balance mechanism is fully integrated with a greenhouse gas fuel intensity standard. So that's the kind of tie-in that we need. It applies a fee on fossil fuels, then allocates the funds to green fuels so that the average cost of fuel is roughly equal. The fees and allocation of funds are calculated annually based on the amount of green fuel used and market prices, balancing out the cost across very different fuels. And the greater the greenhouse gas emissions reductions a fuel delivers on a well-to-wake life cycle basis, the greater the financial allocation received. This accelerates the uptake of the greenest fuels, delivering the deepest greenhouse gas reductions. At the same time, all the fuels that deliver greenhouse gas reductions above the standards established in the Green Balance Mechanism, they receive some allocation proportional to their greenhouse gas emission reduction. So the emissions reductions required for a fuel to receive an allocation would follow the IMO commitments to decarbonisation over time, starting at a reduction of 65% compared to fossil fuels and increasing in stringency to reach the 2050 net zero target. So the Green Balance Mechanism includes a framework to create a parallel IMO net zero fund, because we need truly global solutions and not regional or national ones. And this would raise funds for research and development and demonstration projects, climate mitigation initiatives to provide a just and equitable transition. So not allocating funds only for building ships in the EU, for instance, which I was told by a European Commissioner when I challenged them in March regarding the EU ETS. So yeah, it's something that could make it attractive for ship owners and energy providers to invest, and we need investment and we need that done swiftly to deliver those greenhouse gas reductions. Using this mechanism, we believe that the production of the cleanest fuels will grow much more quickly, accelerating economies of scale to push down the cost of green fuels and reduce the cost of the transition as a whole. That is what we believe a global approach should look like.
And I think that's completely needed. You mentioned well to wake. So if we're not using green fuel, so if you use blue hydrogen, grey hydrogen, your emissions are higher than if you were burning diesel. So that's an issue for well to wake at the moment. We need to do it, but actually having that 40% target by 2030, that's efficiency gains potentially that we can put on vessels using technology, whilst these fuels, that we haven't got enough green electricity to create all of this fuel. That's the problem. There's not enough green power, or pink power if we're going to use nuclear reactors. There's not enough power to do this, to create the fuels and everything else we need. That's the biggest issue we have. So having a lower target, which we can actually do on vessels, with then the stretch target so that the fuels can come on board, because it's going to take quite a few years to have enough green power to then create these fuels.
Yeah, and also you said there's not enough green power, but in this country especially, we've got an issue where there are gigawatts of projects waiting to be connected to the grid. So it's not just the fact that we don't have the energy, it's getting it to where it needs to be. This is also a challenge.
But then you go down that isolated approach and go, okay, so if we're doing it, right, if we've got an issue getting it on the grid, then let's make hydrogen, and then build from hydrogen into ammonia and methanol or whichever other solution and carrier we want to use, but you could use that to then move it around. It's not great of an overall efficiency perspective, but you're still maximising that green production rather than just turning wind turbines off.
Just adding to that one, we did a little study a year or two ago to look into exactly that. What if we couldn't grid connect, say, the Celtic Sea licence round of the floating offshore wind developments? What if we can't grid connect? What else could we do with the energy? So I had a quick look at the AIS data set from the MMO, looked at how many ships they are, sizes, power, speed, made a few very rough assumptions, looked at the powering calcs, looked at the energy demand, said, okay, well, let's assume, because it's deep sea, let's assume it's ammonia for now, from the Haber-Bosch process, from hydrogen, which is generated by electrolysis from your wind turbine. So you've got all those losses associated with that as well. Very quick back of the fag packet type calcs, but it came out to about 30 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity required to service the shipping in the southwest of the UK. And so that helped, I thought. It was really interesting for us because it just put a bit of scale to perspective, because on the head we've got 16 gigawatts at the moment grid connected in the UK of offshore wind, and this is like double that. And then so just kind of bounds it a little bit, or at least kind of puts a scale out there. So it's too bad.
Okay, final question. all of you are involved in decarbonisation. You're all involved in projects, whether they're efficiency projects or projects with clean fuels. Give us an example of what you've learnt, maybe some best practice lessons learned from those projects that you have been involved in today.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off if that's all right. So the Port of London Authority is a contributory partner in a Marry UK funded project called the Maritime Hydrogen Highway. This was a project which is coming to a close this year, so we're really starting to get some of the learnings through now. And really it's the aim of the project was to look at the safe and scalable production, transportation and bunkering of green hydrogen for the Thames and also the UK. It's been an absolutely fascinating project, and we're just at the moment looking at some of the findings of one of the work packages which looked at creating, or rather transporting containerised compressed hydrogen in the kinds of shipping containers that we see as standard. One of the exciting things about that is that obviously it can be moved in the same way that other cargo is at the moment. It creates this seamless value chain from platform to crane to vessel to port and onwards, which obviously creates efficiencies and cost savings. The other advantage involved in that is the vessels transporting them themselves can be powered by the hydrogen that they are transporting. And some of the early modelling on the costs that we're seeing at pump is a cost per kilogram of more like £6 to £7 per kilogram, as opposed to 14 per kilogram, which we've seen in other generation models. So obviously it's early days and we're just waiting for the reports to come through, but later this year or even in the next couple of months, but certainly before the end of the year, we'll be very, very happy and excited to share the results of that project to anybody that's interested, so watch this space.
So I know as part of the National Maritime Hydrogen Working Group earlier this year, we sat down with class societies, Bureau Veritas and Lloyd's Register, and the question was, because we've been asked, we're seeing some of these clean maritime CNBC competition projects, they're not really going the way we want, what's happening? And actually what we found was that the government is saying, you need to do this vessel in a year or 2 years. And talking to class, it's a 4-year programme. And that was an issue. So what we've now gone from there is trying to explain to government, and actually we had chats with the MCA and they said, yeah, we've been trying to say this as well. So now we're getting everyone, all industry that are involved, going to the government and saying, look, we need to change this. The response we got back was, it's Treasury. Well, let's change how we're doing it then. We can do that. It's just a little bit of policy. It's governments, it's probably going to take at least this government to get that policy changed the way they normally work. But we can do things, and we need to start moving things so it is actually feasible, and we're not seeing some of these smaller companies potentially collapsing.
Yeah, agreed. I think, like I said, time frames is a big one, and that it ties up with vessel time frames and the funding time frames aligned with that. That makes good sense. I think the other one from our observations is collaboration across a whole load of stakeholders. So, we're naval architects and engineers. We understand some parts of it, but not all of it. And we're working with classification societies, with regulators, flag states, for instance, fuel providers, fuel cell system providers. You've got a whole lot of knowledge from lots of different individuals, and you need to foster that at that early stage, all the requirements from class and regulatory side. But for me, the observation's been collaboration.
Yeah, and just to respond to that, completely agree. The consortia-based approach that we've taken with the Hydrogen Highway really speaks to that, and I suppose that those partnerships and those relationships that are built through the process, and obviously this is something that's initiated through government, with government funding, they're going to be lasting. Yep. So even though it's a pilot project in and of itself, with admittedly demonstrator aspects to it, but ultimately, we'll get the learnings and we'll move forward with the learnings rather than things on the ground. The relationships that are built through that are the things that we really want to capitalise on, and that, for the next 5-10 years, that's going to be the key. So I completely agree with that.
I think collaboration is the number one alternative fuel, isn't it? However you look at it. Clean cargo started back in the noughties, and it quickly came to represent about 80 to 90% of all global freight that was shipped. And that's been a powerful force in the background pushing container shipping lines, because their biggest customers were pushing them to make sure that they were shipping sustainably. The recent local project that I mentioned earlier, onboard carbon capture, so that's a consortium involving HMM to operate the vessel and have all the equipment fitted, and Samsung Heavy Industries to do the CO2 liquefaction and some of that engineering, Pan Asia, who specialise in carbon capture, and a company that uses CO2 to preserve food, because they're buying the product, which is carbon and CO2, to use to preserve foodstuffs, etc. That might not always be the answer, but it's a great collaboration. And similarly, as container ships, we're using ISO tanks to store the CO2. And we're going through the process at the moment, and it will be used to determine what the rules and regulations should be for the rollout of onboard carbon capture, which, for instance, combined with some other things like biofuels, make a big difference, and carbon capture related to methanol. If you're capturing the carbon from the air to make the thing, then it's a little bit more circular. Lots of challenges, but collaboration, number one fuel, this alternative for the future.
Thanks. Any questions from the audience as we're running up towards the end? Yes, go for it.
As well as being a cameraman, I suspect I'm probably the only publicly elected official, formally publicly elected. I was a town councillor for 4 years in East Suffolk, so I've got quite an interesting view on a lot of these topics, from Sizewell C to Felixstowe, Port of Felixstowe. And I'm finding it interesting listening to sort of mostly representatives of the private sector talking about climate change. And is it not perhaps the case that much of the responsibility is on the shoulders of the private sector? Because you've been talking a lot about what the state and what the government has to do, when actually a lot of the problems and the carbon emissions themselves have actually not come from the public sector, but the private sector, particularly the private sector in the West. And so, is it not, do you not feel that perhaps there's more responsibility on the private sector to try and solve this issue than it is for the government or the state?
Yeah, you're completely right. You can't keep doing that and then taking government money or taxpayers' money to then fund your research when the stakeholders or shareholders are making exorbitant amounts of cash. Some of the research that's going on in the UK, so if you take CMDC, it is match funding, which means, so as a large company, you are putting 50% of your own money in. And that's at the feasibility stage. When you're going into more operational stages, you can be talking down to like 25%. So we are expecting companies to do this, but you're also seeing some companies like Maersk pretty much doing it, HMM are doing it. There may well be, I don't know, but there may well be some government funding, but they are investing significant amounts of money. They're seeing that they need to do this as well now.
Sorry, just to add on, like I say, I think it's absolutely right that the observation there that the private sector needs to be doing something here as well. I think coming back to government role might be to set the framework. What's the target? What do they need to actually do and be measured by? To set the targets, because otherwise you might find that some private sector companies might want to step up to that mark and some will, and then that makes it unfair because the ones that are stepping up to the mark are the ones that will be carrying the burden of the costs. So I think that there's still a government role there, but setting targets. Private sector wise, like I said, total mixture. Some of it's R&D funded by the government, and then us as a industrial company, as a private sector, you know, we want to make our commitment, and so that's what we're doing with our own contribution and cost. So that's some of our projects. We've had another one which was for Fortescue, so they're, you know, a massive mining company out in Australia. We helped them with the ammonia conversion for their platform supply boat. Now that was fully funded by Fortescue as a private sector company. They set up a separate division called Fortescue Future Industries, FFI, to do those projects. And then, interestingly, they then in their financial report said, well, now FFI, this Fortescue Future Industries, is not making profit because they're reinvesting for a cleaner future. And then that affected their share price. It dips downwards, unfortunately. And then that creates a whole other dynamic in terms of the investment and the markets and everything else that goes with it. So something to be, you know, careful with, but it's that we do see, you know, goods commitment from the private sector as well.
And yeah, if you, going back to one of the earlier questions, it's the person in the mirror, it's the consumer that's responsible for generating the need for goods and where those goods might be manufactured and how they're transported. Going back to the early comment that I made about clean cargo, it was because two companies were arguing about their carbon emissions, and it's because one of them was trying to say that they'd lower carbon emissions, and there was no standard. So the industry initiative was kind of triggered by some of the consumers wanting to make sure that they had greener products, but you needed that government style of intervention to trigger off something that could facilitate a real change in behaviour. But it is very much consumers that drive a lot of this, so it's our choices that determine some of the things that happen global supply chain wise. HMM wise, yeah, we're largely not government funded. Having said that, we are partially government owned indirectly. So it is, you know, there are all sorts of conflicts of interest and different agendas going on in global supply chain and how everything works. But I think especially container shipping and maritime in general, there is a way forward. We can see how to do stuff. The technology exists, so I think it's quite optimistic future-wise, albeit not easy to reach net zero.
We've got time for one more, and then Nick was...
He's going to come down to the floor.
Okay, that's fine. Is that time now? Very good. Thank you all. Round of applause for the panel.